So, just we were discussing the topic of the transmission of Kabbalah, how Kabbalah was transmitted from generation to generation, what Kabbalah is, its different parts, and what makes it different than the way the halachic aspect of Torah was transmitted. So just to recap a little bit of what we mentioned last week, which is more of just an introduction to the topic in general, was that obviously Kabbalah is a section in Torah that was given over from Hashem to Moshe Rabbeinu, just like everything else was given over from Hashem to Moshe Rabbeinu. However, what was unique about Kabbalah is that, as we mentioned, every aspect of Torah is practical. Every aspect of Torah has to be learned in order to be applied in a practical sense. Like and I mentioned before, obviously Hilchos Shabbos, the aspect of Torah which is called halacha, the revealed part of Torah, is very obvious how it's applied practically. Kabbalah, it's the true application of Kabbalah. It was supposed to be, in the way as Hashem, when Mashiach comes, it will be, was that it was the practical way how a person would reach the level of prophecy. That was the true application of what Kabbalah was. And we clarified that because of this, there is two parts of Kabbalah. There's what's called Ma'aser Bereishis, which is the basic, the scientific or the cerebral, the theoretical aspect of Kabbalah, which explains the way the universe works, the way how Hashem created the universe, and the relationship that Hashem has with the universe, even to this day. And then there's what's called Ma'aser Merkava, which was the practical, the way how the Navi would use that intellectual knowledge that he mastered in Ma'aser Bereishis and actually apply that in his ability to ascend and to raise himself from this world to the world above and that involved very, very deep mysteries of using Hashem's names, of meditation on Hashem's names, and so on. It was a very, very difficult thing. But during the times of the Nevi'im, this is what was going on. Now, it's important to remember, that's why during the times of prophecy, there were different yeshivas. A person that, let's say he wanted to spend his lifetime in yeshiva, there was a choice that he would have to make. Am I interested in becoming a rabbi, part of the Sanhedrin, someone who's going to be an expert and a leader as far as the halachic aspect of Torah is concerned? Or do I want to be the type of aesthetic that sees within himself the potential of being a Navi? There are yeshivas for Nevi'im. There are yeshivas to develop, and there were yeshivas dedicated to developing Nevi'im. In the terminology of Tanakh, these students in the yeshiva of Nevi'im were called Bnei HaNevi'im, the sons of the Nevi'im. Sons meaning a euphemism for students. So in other words, these were yeshivas that were set up. And as Chazal tell us, in our history, we've had over 1.5 million Nevi'im, meaning, and not everyone that went to the yeshiva, just like nowadays, not everyone that goes to yeshiva becomes a rabbi at the end. So too, not everyone that went to Navi school eventually became a Navi. The ones that excelled at it, that actually became Nevi'im, were over 1.5 million. So my point is that this was something that was widespread throughout Klal Yisrael. All of Klal Yisrael knew about it. All of Klal Yisrael was aware of what Kabbalah was. They didn't necessarily know the details of it, but they knew of its existence. They knew of its importance, and they felt its influence on them. Because you walk outside and you see Nevi'im, you hear Nevi'im, you see people that are connected to the higher world. It changes a person. It changes society. So Kabbalah was like that. By the way, it's an interesting thing on the side. We actually still have within our tradition, we have a record of the stipulations of what it took to be accepted by the yeshivas of the Nevi'im. This is something that's actually recorded from the students of the Arizal. The Arizal taught this. It's in the back. It's all the way at the end of Shar Kedusha, one of the writings of the Arizal, a whole list that Reb Chaim Vital wrote down of different qualifications that a person would need in order to even be accepted into these yeshivas. And it's fascinating. We actually, this past Shavuos in Hashivenu, we actually went through this Shavuos night, and it's a fascinating thing just to see what it took to be accepted. And the stuff that it would take to be accepted in those yeshivas, it's interesting. Nowadays, that would just the qualifications alone to be accepted would make a person into the Gad Hadar. There's no question about it. But that was just the admittance into the yeshiva. But it's a fascinating topic to study about. In any event, that's what was taking place during the times of the Nevi'im. So Kabbalah was definitely the people that were experts, the people that were the ones that held onto Kabbalah, the transmitters of Kabbalah, the greatest experts in Kabbalah were the Nevi'im. They were the Nevi'im, there's no question. Once Nevuah stopped with the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, Now, why Nevuah stopped with the destruction of the first base condition is also an interesting topic, maybe at some point. But Nevuah stopped after the destruction of the first base condition, generally speaking. Now, what happened then? So, nevertheless, Chazal do say that even though proper Nevuah, Nevuah in its purest sense stopped with the destruction of the first base of Mikdash, there was still an ability of the Jewish person to be able to nevertheless transcend physical life and attach himself to the spiritual world, maybe not to the extent of true prophecy, but Ruach HaKodesh, for example, was still very much involved. Bas Kols were very much involved. And just like when it comes to true prophecy, the only way for a person to really attach himself to that ultimate level was through a very intimate knowledge of Kabbalah and a practical application of Kabbalah. So too it was with Ruach HaKodesh, and so too it was with the Bas Kol. The only way for a person to reach the level that at least you were able to reach at that time was also through this intimate knowledge. That's why throughout the time period of even the Tanoim, we find that the greatest of the Tanoim were also experts in this knowledge, in the mysteries of Torah. For example, one of the famous stories of Tanoim, of great tzaddikim, using their knowledge of Kabbalah in a practical way to reach a level that was close to prophecy, was the famous incident of Dalat Shenichnasu L'Pardes, 4 Tanoim that entered into the orchard. Entering into the orchard is a way of Chazal describing this experience of the Jew using his knowledge of Kabbalah in practical terms and ascending from his level down here to the world above, not in true prophecy, because true prophecy was taken away after the destruction of the first temple. However, the level that they were able to reach at that generation, that's what it means, Dalet Shenichnasu L'Pardes, 4 that entered the orchard. The Rabbi Kiva, Ben Zoma, Ben Azai, and Elisha ben Avuya. And we know the Gemara tells us that 3 out of the 4 did not come out the same way they went in. One of them, Ben Azai was killed, Ben Zoma lost his mind, Elisha ben Avuya went off the derech. The experiences that they experienced in the involvement in these areas of Torah was so intense that it actually injured them, psychologically, physically, spiritually. The only one that went in and went out with peace was Rabbi Kiva. In other words, what was taking place was that as the generations went on after prophecy ended, the mysteries of Kabbalah were still being transmitted, but since true prophecy ended, and the ability, the ceiling that a Jew is able to reach in his spiritual ascent to the higher world is now limited, and after every generation it got even more and more limited. So the teaching, the knowledge of Kabbalah and the spreading of Kabbalah and the publicity of Kabbalah also dwindled. When it comes to prophecy, you can have prophets walking around, prophesizing what's going to be. That means that the knowledge of Kabbalah is going to be widespread. But as that ended, and spiritual awareness and the ability of reaching higher levels in the higher world became more and more difficult. So to the teaching of Kabbalah became more and more rare, to the point of where it actually took place during the times of Chazal, during the times of the Gemara, and so on. There were only very, very select secret groups that taught Kabbalah, that transmitted Kabbalah from Rebbe to student. And because again, this was not something, since the practical application of Kabbalah was something that was entering into the shadows. That was not something that was becoming popular at all. It was becoming more and more rare of how to apply this knowledge. So because of that, it started to exit the main consciousness of the Jewish people. And as the generations went on, this knowledge became more and more secretive. It became more and more rare for people to know, and it was only transmitted from specific rebbeim to specific students. Because again, not only was the application of this knowledge not becoming more and more difficult to apply, it was actually becoming more and more dangerous. Because as the generations went on and more impurity came into the world with Christianity and so on, and with the diminishment, with Yeridus Hadoros, with the diminishing stature of the Jewish soul, as generations go on, people get less and less, in their levels of Yiddishkeit. So not only did the practical application of Kabbalah and the ability of a Jew to ascend to the higher world become more and more difficult, it got more and more dangerous, because it not only is there more of a distance between heaven and earth now as the world went on, as generations went on, there was much more impurity in the world. And because of that, the climb from this world to the higher world is much more of a dangerous climb. And because of all these factors, Kabbalah therefore became something that was relegated to the side. It was relegated to specific secret societies, to specific secret rabbanim that would teach their specific hand-picked students. And as generations went on, and this was kept on taking place and getting more and more extreme in the exclusivity of the teaching of Kabbalah. Again, because number one, the application it's much less rare. It's much more rare, and number two, it's much more dangerous to actually apply it. To use it in a practical sense of ascending to the higher world is much more dangerous. So because of that, again, like I said, it became much more rare in how it was taught and how it was presented. To the point where it actually evolved in the Jewish people, where you had major societies of people that were unaware of even its existence. What's fascinating to know, however, is that in Ashkenaz, in Europe, during the times of the Rishonim, in the Middle Dark Ages and so on, what's fascinating is that in Ashkenaz culture, Kabbalah was for the most part, was part of society. Now, I'm not saying that everyone learned Kabbalah, for sure not, but the Rabbanim, the Gedolim, the leaders of Ashkenazic Jewry were Mekubalim themselves. Rashi was one of the greatest Mekubalim. Rabbeinu Tam, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, the Rekech, these were unbelievable Mekubalim, tremendous Mekubalim. And even though, despite the fact that Kabbalah was never taught openly in Ashkenaz, there's no question during Hamza Rishon, it's not like Rabbeinu Tam or Rashi were teaching Kabbalah to the masses. However, if the leadership were Mekubalim themselves, there's no question that the philosophy, the ideology of Kabbalah and the hashkafa that comes from a Judaism that's rooted in Kabbalah has an effect on the masses. And the hashkafa of Ashkenazic Jewry was definitely molded by the fact that their leadership were Mekubalim. What's fascinating is by the Sephardim it was not like that. By the Sephardim was very much divided. You had Sephardim that had the tradition of Kabbalah, that were part of that secret society of transmitting the secrets of Kabbalah, as we mentioned, the Ramban and so on. However, amongst the Sephardim, you had major groups that were not even aware of Kabbalah's existence. For example, the Rambam, he was unaware of its existence. And what's fascinating is because of the Rambam's not being part of that tradition of Rebbe to Talmud and that secret society, when the Rambam learned the Gemaras and Tainis, for example, that describe Maisa Bereshis and Maisa Merkava, the workings of creation and the workings of the chariot, the Rambam, because he didn't have the tradition of what exactly that meant, the Rambam understood that to mean biology and sciences. And what's difficult with the Rambam is that, as the Mekubalim point out, is that why should the Gemara talks about how these mysteries of creation and so on should be transmitted privately and secretly in a very serious way. They all ask on the Rambam, what science is something that's so mysterious that can't be transmitted, can't be taught publicly. But again, all this was because the Rambam didn't have this in his tradition. Now, all this changed when the Arizal came on the scene. Once the Arizal entered the Jewish world in the 1500s, it's completely changed everything on its head, and that really was a beginning of a new era in how Kabbalah was looked at, how Kabbalah was transmitted, and so on. And it's a very, very fascinating point of history, and it's very important. And as we'll see, maybe next week we'll finish this off. Maybe we'll see how this was not only a shift from the Arizal and on. Not only was it a shift in the Jewish people's awareness of Kabbalah, but it also, according to the Kabbalah themselves, something was taking place in heaven, and the world was being prepared for Mashiach to come in a very unbelievable way. But just from the times of the Nevi'im to the times of the Arizal, what was taking place was what was having, instead of Kabbalah being something that was widespread and known by the times of the prophets, it was becoming more and more secretive, more and more exclusive, and less known to the masses. And again, the reason is that, like I said, twofold. First of all, the practical application of this knowledge was more and more rare, was more and more less practical, and number two, it was more and more difficult and more dangerous. So putting all those factors together, it became much more secretive and much more rare, to the point where, to the times of the Arizal, you had serious groups of Jews, specifically of Sephardic descent, that were not even aware of it, and their perspective of Judaism was much more rooted in philosophy than it was Kabbalah. And again, this is where we see that divide that was taking place. It was becoming more and more apparent till the times of the Arizal. From the Arizal and on, things change, and maybe we'll stop with here. I guess if there's any questions, if not, we can continue on with this. If there's no question, we can continue for another few minutes if that's okay. Yeah, okay. Now, what changed with the Arizal? What changed with the Arizal is the following: the Arizal was such an overwhelming light that just like a comet through the sky. He was only, the truth is, he only was in Eretz Yisrael teaching his writings only for a number of months. We're not talking about years. We're talking about a very, very small amount of time. However, the overwhelming brilliance and the overwhelming just power of the Arizal, what he did was the following thing. Ever since the Arizal came, no longer could anyone doubt the beauty of Kabbalah, the existence of Kabbalah, and how Kabbalah is so important to understand Judaism. Until the Arizal, you had Mekubalim, you had philosophers, and and never the twain shall meet. Once the Arizal came, his light was so unbelievably overwhelming. His brilliance and the clarity of his vision was so unbelievable. It got to the point of where no one was able to doubt that, this is it. This is the essence of Yiddishkeit. And when the Arizal revealed himself and revealed his teachings, when now you compare philosophy to that, there's nothing to talk about. It's so beneath the level of true Kabbalah that was revealed by the Ari that it blew philosophy out of the water, and it blew Judaism-based philosophy out of the water. And from that point and on, I'm not saying, not necessarily was the Arizal teaching Kabbalah in public, even though he was teaching it to a more general audience than it was until then. But there's no question that the influence of Kabbalah, the clarity of Kabbalah, with the perspective of Kabbalah, now spread not just from Ashkenaz, it spread to the entire Jewish people. What's fascinating is that nowadays it seems to be a little bit of the reverse what it was historically. Historically, Ashkenazim were much more rooted in Kabbalah, and Sephardim were more rooted in philosophy. Nowadays, it's a fascinating thing. You have somewhat of the reverse. That Sephardim are much more, comfortable with Kabbalah and much more open with these things. And Ashkenazim, except for the Hasidic movement, which we'll get to hopefully soon, the general Ashkenazic world is much less connected and less open to talking and learning about Kabbalah than Sephardim. But all that changed with the Arizal. Again, like I said, from the Arizal and on, the Jewish people were overtaken by the clarity of Kabbalah. Now, the Arizal himself revealed that this was not something that was just an arbitrary thing that he decided, or Hashem decided, to now let the world in on a little secret known as Kabbalah. The Arizal taught that this was actually the beginning of the process of redemption. Like we mentioned before, since Kabbalah, the real purpose of Kabbalah is in order to teach a person how to ascend to the level of prophecy. So the Arizal said, as we get closer to Mashiach, we have to prepare the world for this. Because as the pasuk says in Yoel, there's a pasuk in Yoel that says that when Mashiach comes, Eshvoch es ruchi al kol basar, Hashem's spirit is going to be poured over all of flesh. In other words, all of the Jewish people are going to become prophets. Now, you can't go from a regular Joe to the next day, to the next morning, waking up as a prophet. You have to be exposed to the things that will turn you into a prophet. So the Arizal explained that what the time period of Ikvus de Mashiach, of the footsteps of Mashiach, the Arizal said began at his generation, and as the generations go on from the Arizal to this day, there's an acceleration. There's an acceleration of the necessity of Kabbalah and these concepts to become more widespread and become more common knowledge in order to prepare the world and the individual Jew to eventually get to the level of prophecy where we're all destined to get to when Mashiach comes. So on a general collective perspective, there was a dip and a raise in the general Jewish world. In times of prophecy, Kabbalah was at its height. Everyone was aware of it, and it was widespread, and so on. As the exile took place, the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and Golus set in a very, very dark way. So there was a decrease in the knowledge of Kabbalah. There's a decrease in its influence over the Jewish people. But once the Arizal came, and now this is then considered to be the beginning of the Ikvus of the Mashiach, the beginning of the footsteps of Mashiach, of the process of redemption actually happening, as slow as it might seem, that was actually the beginning of the uphill rise of Kabbalah again, of becoming more mainstream, more widespread, all ultimately leading to what we're all hoping for, which is Mashiach himself, to the point of where prophecy will actually return. And this is how it goes. This was the rise, the rise, the fall, and the rise again of the influence of Kabbalah and so on. And this is what Kabbalah is. Okay, I guess we could stop with this. Again, if there's any questions, we could end off with that.
can hear me. I'm sorry. We just opened it up for questions again in case anybody had any questions. Going once, twice. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and we'll pick it up again next week. Thank you, Yossi.
Thank you very much. Yeshivah.